You lie down for the night. Beneath the plaster platform supporting your body is the folded skeleton of someone who once lived in this room. At Çatalhöyük, a 9,000-year-old settlement in what is now central Turkey, this was not an isolated burial. It was part of the architecture. The houses were packed together so tightly that there were almost no streets. You entered through the roof, climbed down a ladder, cooked beside the wall, worked on raised platforms, and probably slept on those same plastered surfaces. Under many of them were the dead. Archaeologists found adults, children, and infants buried beneath floors, benches, hearths, and platforms. Adults were often placed beneath the larger platforms in the main room, while babies and young children could be buried in other domestic areas. The bodies were usually drawn tightly into a crouched position, wrapped in mats, textiles, or baskets, then lowered into pits before the floor was sealed with plaster again. So why keep a corpse inside the house? The obvious answer is love, but the archaeology suggests something more complicated. Ian Hodder, who directed decades of excavation at Çatalhöyük, argued that houses were not simply shelters. They accumulated history. Walls were replastered repeatedly. Buildings were dismantled and rebuilt on nearly the same footprint. Objects, animal remains, paintings, and human bodies became embedded in the structure. The house remembered. Burying someone beneath the floor may have tied that person to the household, even after death. Their body became part of the place where food was prepared, children were raised, tools were repaired, and stories were repeated. But these were not always simple family graves. Bioarchaeologists Marin Pillaud and Clark Spencer Larson compared teeth from people buried in the same buildings. Tooth shape is partly inherited, so close biological relatives often share subtle dental traits. Their results suggested that many people buried together were not closely related. That changes the question. Perhaps a household at Çatalhöyük was not defined only by blood. It may have included adopted members, allies, workers, ritual partners, or people connected to the history of the building itself. Burial beneath a particular house could declare belonging rather than parentage. And the dead did not always stay untouched. Scott Haddow and Christopher Newsell documented cases in which graves were reopened after decomposition. Skulls were removed. Bones were rearranged. In one extraordinary burial, a skull taken from an earlier individual was placed with another body. This was not necessarily grave robbery. It may have been a controlled ritual in which certain remains were retrieved, circulated, remembered, and eventually buried again. Imagine the scene. Someone in the household dies. The floor is cut open. An older burial may appear beneath it. The living must work carefully around bones already resting there. A tightly wrapped body is lowered into the earth, perhaps beside people who died years earlier. The pit is filled. Wet plaster covers the cut. By the next evening, the room looks ordinary again. A fire burns nearby. Smoke rises toward the roof opening. Grain is ground. Children cross the platform. Someone sits, works, or sleeps directly above the grave. The dead are physically hidden, but everyone knows exactly where they are. To a modern viewer, that sounds disturbing because you separate the living from the dead. Cemeteries sit outside homes. Bodies disappear behind professional rituals. Death is removed from daily space and returned only through photographs, anniversaries, or names. At Çatalhöyük, separation may have been the disturbing idea. Keeping the dead beneath the house could protect continuity. It made ancestry physical. It turned memory into architecture. Each burial said, "This person still belongs here, and this house is more than mud brick." There is one important limit. Archaeologists can locate the bodies, study the bones, and reconstruct how graves were opened. They cannot know exactly what the inhabitants believed. The platforms may have been used for sleeping, sitting, working, or several activities. Sleeping above the dead is plausible, but not directly witnessed. What is certain is stranger enough. For generations, people repeatedly placed human remains beneath active domestic spaces and continued living above them. You did not visit your ancestors. You entered through the roof, crossed the plaster floor, and lived inside the place that held them.